All right, welcome. Thank you for joining us in person and online at the second Reconciliation and Design Dialogue of 2023. We will start off with a land acknowledgement. We are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Musqueam people. And for those of you online, I'll invite you to waterfall into the chat which territory you are on. And of course, if you haven't thought about that before or looked it up, nativeland.ca is a great starting point for looking up your land acknowledgement. I will frame today by saying that decolonization is a work for all of us, and indigenization is, of course, the amplification of Indigenous voices. And I am really excited to be here with so many of you to listen. And I'll hand over to Dean James Wilson. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thanks, Pam. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here to say a few words before we start. It's great to have people here in person. Welcome to those who are here. Welcome to all of those who are online. I just wanted to, well, first start by thanking people for all of those who have been involved in putting together not just today's event, but the entire dialogue series. A special thank you, of course, to Pam Wolf, and of course to our online, and our special thank you to our special speaker who is online, Colleen. Thank you so much for being here today with us. I did want to just spend a minute talking about the context of today's event in terms of our strategic plan. And I would say that 4 years ago, we really embarked on what was an ambitious journey to build a hopeful vision for our future. And in 2020, coinciding with the pandemic, we launched Transforming Tomorrow, which is the Faculty of Applied Science strategic plan. The commitments that we made through the priorities that are within the strategic plan were really around increasing our impact on the world across the scales of people, what I would say is people, place, and planet. And the priorities that we talked about were, that we identified were solutions for people, thriving cities and communities, and planetary health, to give a sense of individuals to communities to the planet on which we are on. And we talked about those three priorities as being our commitment to transforming the world. The other three priorities that we identified or committed to within the strategic plan were around recognizing that in order to meet that ambition to transform the world, we needed to start by transforming ourselves. And so we created priorities that were around preparing ourselves for future work, creating the university of the future, and building inclusive leaders with competencies and respectful engagement. And our commitment to transform ourselves, to learn to be and to create inclusive leaders, to then transform the professions in which we belong to, are part of us enabling real impact on the world, transforming ourselves to transform. And that's really why we are here today and why this event is so special and important to the fact that it's really part of our ethos. So I appreciate the presentation today. I appreciate all of that's gone into it. Turn it back to you now.
Thank you so much. A form of how we sit down together that we often hear about is debate. And debate is really useful when there is one expected to be one clear, correct answer and no other answers that are right. And it doesn't serve us very well when we want to weave together different correct answers. The theme of tonight is synthesis. And after Colleen speaks, we're going to be sitting down in circles, whether they're virtual or here in person, and weaving together what we hear from Colleen with our own practice, whether we're professionals or academics or indeed engineering students. And so I encourage you, while you're listening to Colleen, to really listen and to really sort of be listening for specifically the details and maybe taking even a few notes of what we're going to weave later into our own practices and day-to-day. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Colleen, I've known Colleen for over a decade, and when I first met her, she was introducing me to Hans Rosling. And I was reflecting on that, and I thought, you know, he is one of the most rigorous people in thinking about statistics and also quality of life, and thinking about those things together. And through the leadership that I have had the honor of witnessing Colleen build in her own career from then until now, I think that careful intellectual rigor and that always commitment to community and to people and to people's quality of life is the same the minute I met her until now. So I'm so excited to share that with everyone here tonight. And Danilo, before we get started.
Before we start, it's my honor to express gratitude for having Colleen here, and in an Ojibwe custom, Colleen and I sharing that. I get to present you with tobacco as a symbol of our appreciation for the knowledge that you carry and your willingness to share it with us. So, and we'll get this to you. Unfortunately, this is a virtual handoff. Thank you very much. Chimagwich.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Some thumbs up or something? Perfect, thanks, Sarah. To start, I owe a huge amount of credit to the people in my community, both past and present, who've been part of my leadership journey. And Pam and Danilo, you are certainly people that have been a huge part of my leadership journey. So Chimegwich to you both. And Debelina, thank you so much for making sure that all the things that needed to happen happened, and that we are here today. So I will get Sarah to advance to the next slide, please. So as Pam said, today we are talking about synthesis, and this is one of the 4 different dialogues that are going on as part of this reconciliation and design series. So if you haven't already seen Kyle Monkman's presentation from a couple of weeks back, or you aren't already registered for those other presentations, I strongly encourage you to attend in the coming weeks. Next slide, please. So officially, Ani Bojo, Indinawe Maganado, Waseakwe Nidijnikas, Makwa Dodem, Ogijidakwe ni Mama, White Horse Dunjiba. Hello, all my relations. My Anishinaabewim name is Northern Lights Woman. I am Bear Clan. My mom's name is Warrior Woman, which I can are no small shoes to fill in my family. My English name is Colleen O'Toole. I was born in Whitehorse, and I use the pronouns she, they. I am super grateful to live, work, and play on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have cared for this place very briefly known as Vancouver since time immemorial. I grew up with very little connection to my Anishinaabe roots. I was born in Whitehorse, as I said, and I grew up on this small farm in southwestern Ontario. I was gifted my Anishinaabewim name as an adult. I'm a queer, mixed race, Indigenous woman practicing the engineering profession. And while I exist at the intersection of many different identities, or Sidwin Agoso, these and different experiences, I also hold a tremendous amount of power and immense privilege as a white passing person. Mandy Sung, who is a Vancouver-based artist, co-created an exhibit about mixed race identity back in 2016. And they included a poem in that exhibit that has stuck with me ever since. And the last couple of lines of the poem, I'll just paraphrase because I think it's quite important to the discussion that we're having today. And that is, it spoke about being white enough to oppress and be privy to racist jokes. And in my case, Indigenous enough that sometimes those jokes stop mid-sentence. And I think this is really important to highlight because your lived experience is super unique to you, and your experiences ultimately shape your assumptions about the world. And as Kyle Monkman spoke about so brilliantly in the last dialogue session, I'm continuing to explore my own indigeneity and my culture through my actions as a witness and through amplifying voices, truth-telling, and accountability to all my relations. I am not a UBC grad. I graduated from the University of Guelph back in 2008 with a Bachelor of Engineering in Environmental Engineering. And I took the cooperative education program. And my enrollment in that cooperative education program during my undergraduate degree provided me with some really incredible experiences, including the opportunity to live and work in BC to complete one of my work terms. And this ultimately led me upon graduation to accept a position with Corwood Lytle Associates based in Burnaby. And it's a leading employee-owned multidisciplinary consulting firm. And I still work there 15 years later. So who am I? I'm a wife and an auntie. I believe in learning and laughter and play. I'm not afraid of working hard, and I know how important it is to rest. I am an amateur banana slug photographer and a plant mom who tends towards overwatering. My favorite thing is sharing a meal and time with the people that I love. I am a silly sock wearer and a power lifter. I believe in listening to empathize and understand. I'm a maker and a builder of community. And I genuinely believe the world could do much better with a whole bunch more heart and a whole bit less ego. So I'm often singing absent-mindedly and writing snail mail. And I believe in resilient and supportive relationships with each other. And that means that they're rooted in shared challenges, successes, and respect. I value approaching barriers in conflict with curiosity and open-mindedness and generosity. And I hold a deep appreciation for the land and the water and the creatures that we share this world with. And I take action to minimize my impact on the natural environment through my work and through my life. And I genuinely am working towards the idea or the concept of Mino Bimwadziwin, which is like living the good life. And maybe, probably the most relevant to the conversation today about synthesis, I believe that the people who ultimately are impacted by the decisions that we make need to be co-creators or leaders in the solutions that we develop. Next slide, please, Sarah. So what does this mean from a truth perspective? This photo is a portion of a sunrise ceremony to set intentions for the day and to ground one another. We smudged with Bashoke Digibik sage to remind us to have good thoughts, to see the good in people, to hear the good in their words, to say good things to them so that we could walk together in a good way. We also offered our wishes for the day to the sacred Skoden fire with the smoke of medicines Kizig, cedar, and Sima tobacco. I included this photo here both as a reminder to myself and hopefully to everyone that's in this call and in this room today, to ground ourselves in our intentions for this discussion and these dialogues, and how we want to show up today and every day in our words and our actions when we leave these conversations. And we navigate our own respective roles in reconciliation through the design process. We all have a role to play in reconciliation. Decolonizing ourselves, our communities, and our institutions is part of our role in truth and reconciliation as engineers, architects, planners, and other professionals. By decolonizing, we need to focus on shifting power away from us and breaking down the structures of Western frameworks and practices to make sure that we're including and amplifying Indigenous voices, practices, and rights. Indigenous people have done so much work already through TRC, Red Women Rising, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls to do brutal truth-telling and invasive and re-traumatizing experiences to document and share clear actions for us to take as people who live and work on these lands and continue to benefit from racist colonial systems that persist today. So to honor the people who've shared their truths, it's our job to commit to the things that have been asked of us. So what has this system meant for me and my family? I was educated in a Eurocentric system that dismissed Indigenous knowledge as science. My Indigenous education in the school system, when mentioned at all, started to teach me about my history with residential schools and the Indian Act. So that's where we start when we teach kids about Indigenous culture. We miss the richness and the diversity and the joy of Indigenous cultures since time immemorial. And instead, we start by teaching kids about colonialism and trauma. My members of my family were forcibly removed from their homes as part of the 60s scoop and lost status through non-Indigenous marriage and pursuit of post-secondary education under Indian Act, a racist, pervasive piece of legislation that still exists today. And I experienced forced removal of Indigenous ways of knowing and reconstruction with Western frameworks. And when we forcibly move people, Indigenous people, from their communities, when Indigenous knowledge is so contextual and rooted in locality, those things are huge. So knowing this, what does this mean for how I show up in the world? In my own process of decolonization, I'm working to remove Western biases and create spaces that are inclusive and respectful. And reminding myself that Indigenous science, based on numerous scientific and technological innovations that have been definitely time tested, are just as valuable and deserve just as much space. And I also want to make sure that we're making space for Indigenous joy. And we're not just focusing on these acts of trauma and colonialism. So what does this mean for community and how we walk together? Well, we need to acknowledge the colonial legacies and the realities that impact community and recognize the inherent land rights and current barriers and opportunities that exist. And we need to recognize that Indigenous rights and title to land and self-determination are paramount. So this means community-led design, processes, approaches, ideas, and priorities that are coming from community. Next slide, please, Sarah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Indigenous ways of knowing. So I think we need to touch on it prior to speaking about synthesis. And you'll talk more about this with Wanda Rock Thunder in a few weeks. To some of you, this may simply be a photo of some musical instruments, a blanket, some dried grasses, a feather, and some fresh fruit. To me, this photo provides a glimpse of ceremony, of practicing culture. From the day my Mishome, my uncle, taught me to make a diwigan or drum, to the day I received the honor of carrying an eagle feather. to this day, which included prayers and drumming and song in our language, and the sharing of teachings for wingush or sweetgrass, and odemen or strawberries, and a blanket ceremony. The wingush in this photo was grown from seed by my mom, Ogijidakwe, and then she drove it across the country with my uncle, and I cared for it until it was time to harvest. And then my mom and my wife and I harvested it together. We braided it as a family to symbolize the strength of mind, body, and spirit, family, and community. The symbol on the drum in the foreground in this photo is from a petroglyph or stone writing, where my uncle, who is an Odawa Medewin, received his teachings. This place is called Kinowaging Wapkong, or the place, or where the rocks that teach. It's understood that these markings were carved sometimes between 900 and 1400 AD, and this is ancient wisdom shared through markings in stone. I started this talk today by saying hello to all my relations. And I think it's important that we explore that a little bit as we seek to synthesize information in the design process. So I wanted to start with a couple of quotes that I think really speak to this. And the first one is from Richard Wagames in his book Embers. And he says, "I've been considering the phrase all my relations for some time now. In Dinawe Maganado, it's hugely important. It points to the truth that we are all related, that we are all connected, and that we all belong to each other. And the most important word is all. Not just those who look like me, sign like me, dance like me, all my relations. That means every person, just as it means every rock, mineral, blade of grass, and creature. We live because everything else does." When we think about Western science, it often places humans at the top of the hierarchy set to rule over all creatures. And Rupert Ross in Indigenous Healing says, "Without the soil and water, there would be no plant realm. Without the plants, there would be no animal realm. And without all of them, there would be no us. We are not the masters of creation. We are its humble servants." And finally, Elder James Dumont, who is an Anishinaabe elder who holds the highest degree in the sacred Medewin Society of Anishinaabe People, and who was a Native Studies professor at the University of Sudbury, said, "We can only know ourselves when we are in relation to something other than ourselves." So what does this mean when we're talking about coming to know, or when we're talking about coming to know Indigenous ways of knowing? This means we need to be aware of how we hear and how we interpret others' narratives. We need to stay mindful of whose voices continue to be privileged in these conversations. And as engineers and architects and planners and professionals, we are entrusted to make decisions on behalf of populations with highly variable values and belief systems. And if we are to have a project actually suit these populations, we must understand what other ways these people have come to understand existence. And our designs will only serve people better when we accept these different ways of knowing as being valid. So what is the problem, or what is a problem that we're experiencing when we're embarking on synthesizing? What happens if two ways of knowing conflict with one another or appear to conflict with one another? Or if it appears there's absolutely no way to synthesize these two ways of knowing? In the design process, who gets to decide necessarily which assumptions are valuable and which ones are not? And as humans, we tend to bucket things as problems when we have seen or experienced something and we couldn't understand it. And I think as this group of professionals, as applied scientists and other folks who are working on these types of projects, we're actually really good at solving problems if we can use or evoke either or thinking. But as soon as we're put into a position where a problem isn't actually a problem, it's a paradox, and it requires us to have both and thinking, we aren't often positioned with the tools that we need to be able to tackle those things. And how can both of those pictures of reality be held to be true at the same time? So with polarities or paradoxes, we aren't looking to discover this one true picture of reality, but rather we're looking at constructing the fullest and clearest picture of the situation by holding our best collective knowledge at the same time. Paradoxes, as Brené Brown says in her book Atlas of the Heart, challenge us to straddle the tension of two elements that appear to be in conflict and recognize that both can actually be true. They help us to understand the fullness of life, and they allow us to think deeper with more complexity, because we can't just solve them. Although, as an engineering brain, I would love to solve it with rationality and logic. We actually need to allow these seemingly contradictory things to exist at the same time in order to gain understanding. And they force us to think in much more expansive ways and to be extremely vulnerable, which makes them hard and good. So when we're navigating these things, when we're navigating these paradoxes, some things are likely going to show up. We're going to fear losing these systems or these things that we've come to value. And we need to work towards the upsides of both of these values, both Western science and Indigenous science. And the reality is that if you overemphasize one value or one of these perspectives over time, you will get the downsides of both of them. Being able to solve problems with either or thinking and being able to leverage polarities with both and thinking are both critical skills. Next slide, please. Synthesis. So this is defined as a combination of ideas to form a theory or a system. I included this photo of my wife and I and those Wingush braids that we prepared for our wedding. And I think it symbolizes so beautifully this concept of braiding Indigenous science with Western science that Gloria Snively and Lorna Williams wrote about in their Knowing Home book. And they said, linked by braiding, there is a certain reciprocity amongst strands. All the strands hold together, each strand remains a separate entity, a certain tension is required, but all strands come together to form the whole. When we braid Indigenous science with Western science, we acknowledge that both ways of knowing are legitimate forms of knowledge. This means that no single culture has a monopoly on a generation of scientific knowledge. They are both Western science and Indigenous science are knowledge systems that were developed from culture-based ways of experiencing and making sense of the world. Each of these knowledge systems, in its own way, basically relies on empirical data, observation, curiosity, experimental procedures, rationality, intuition, and understanding cause and effect relationships. Now, I recognize and feel really fortunate that I primarily work with Indigenous communities directly. And this is the way I prefer to work. And I appreciate the tensions that are created when your client is not the community that you're engaging with. And in those cases, community values may ultimately be directly at odds with the project objectives that you've been assigned to implement with your client. But it's crucial as applied science professionals that no matter what project you're working on and whatever clients or whatever community rather that you're engaging with, the level of influence the people you are engaging with will have on the outcomes of the project are extremely clear. And that if you're asking Indigenous communities to share their knowledge with you, that you are handling that information extremely carefully in a way that honors the traditions and practices and protocols of those communities, and that you aren't sharing information that's not yours to share. In the book that Gloria and Lorna produced, they put together an incredible or conceptualized the key components of learning science from an Indigenous perspective. And they did an immense amount of research. I strongly encourage everyone, if you haven't read that book, to check it out after this. But I feel like they did a really beautiful job. So I wanted to highlight those things and talk a little bit about how those ideas have shown up in how I practice. The first one is learning is a community activity. Learning is holistic, it's relational, it's carried in language, that language is the lens in which we see and interpret the world, that it's rooted in home place, it's experiential, and it's ecological. And a phrase that has stuck with me is the idea of being raised by a river or being raised by the forest and what that means. So in the design process and in synthesis, what does it mean for each of those items? Miriam will talk about kind of integrating community values and goals in technical specifications later in March. But I'm going to focus kind of at the high level of the design process and synthesis, gathering information, options and evaluation, and developing and testing solutions. So when you're starting or you're embarking on this design process and you're gathering information, I think it's really important to seek to understand the relationship with place. Understanding community goals and objectives, talking to community about community plans and visions, and how this project might impact the work that you are trying to do, and how their goals and objectives for their community or their land might show up in this project. And it's really important also to not dictate the process and be agile and willing to adapt. A friend of mine calls this being emotionally nimble, or being willing to change your mind and change your plans. And this kind of showed up for me about a year ago when I was working with a staff member in community to develop a land use plan. And we were working directly with them to make sure that our facilitation materials and our workshop materials for the engagement program were relevant and appropriate for the folks that we were going to be engaging in community. And that was expected to be this diverse group of folks, all different ages, all different backgrounds. And when we got to the space completely set up, we were welcomed by a group of elders and knowledge keepers only. And one of the elders walked up to me and said, I see you've set up all of these different engagement stations. That's lovely. I'm not going to do that. But I'll talk if you'll listen. So my colleague and I tossed the materials, sat down in a circle, and we listened. And that, to me, was so much a reminder that this isn't about my experience. This is about the experience of the people that I'm working with and making sure that they feel heard, and the mediums for which we are gathering this information and the processes need to be driven by community. I think when we're engaging with community, we need to be learning from being on the land. That means actually going to community. We need to speak with one another and listen to the expertise of these communities. We need to understand community profiles and statistics. Who is ultimately going to be attending, and are there people that need to be in the room? Elders, knowledge keepers, youth participation. We need to recognize the importance of language and know that many of the place names that exist today are not their place names, they're colonial names, and that names are tied to places, to narratives, to technologies, to seasons. And if we're doing research, research with Indigenous communities, support the work that they're already doing. Be mindful of the times of years when it makes absolutely no sense to try to coordinate work in community. There are times of year where communities may be hunting or fishing or berry picking, and it will impact people's ability to actually attend information gathering spaces. Understand if there are specific protocols that need to be followed, knowing governance, tribal affiliations, hereditary leaders, elected council, and understand that understanding the community's values and ways of knowing and your way of conducting business when you're going to these communities. One community that I work with is basically was two nations that were forcibly amalgamated by Indigenous Services Canada and relocated to a small semi-rural community that was actually outside of their traditional territory. And while many of their practices were similar, the nations spoke different dialects and had their own distinct cultures. So when we were engaged to just support the development within this IR community, we talked about environmental assessments and archaeological protocols for ground disturbance and the potential for encountering significant intact deposits or ancestral remains, recognizing at the same time that this is actually not the traditional territory of the folks that we're talking to. This is actually a traditional territory of an entirely separate group of folks that we need to be talking to. And those complexities exist, and you need to be mindful of them. And it's important that you don't place the burden of teaching you about this history and culture necessarily on the communities that you're working with. So once you've kind of gone through that process of gathering information, it's important to go back to community and say, this is what we've come to understand. Did we get it right? And as I said before, making sure that the information that you're sharing is being shared in a way that honors the folks that have shared it, and keeping confidences when it needs to be kept. And then listening and actually incorporating any feedback that you get. Secondly, options and evaluation. Once you've taken this information away and you've started to develop some options for how to move forward, taking it back to community again and saying, this is what we heard. What do you prefer? Is there something that we missed? Indigenous folks have time-proven approaches to sustaining community and the environment. We're working with a coastal community that has experienced significant impacts to culturally significant traditional food gathering spaces as a part of industry and coastal erosion. And the community is seeking to reinstate clam gardens within the intertidal zone, working with traditional knowledge holders and marine scientists and coastal engineers. And this approach, while only beginning to be understood by Western scientists, has been utilized for over 5,000 years by Indigenous folks. So our bioengineering solutions aren't necessarily new. And it's important to recognize that this Indigenous knowledge and science is just as valid. And then finally, developing and testing solutions. So asking the question and going back to community and saying, this is what we think. Did we get it right? And giving them the opportunity again to provide feedback to you. Next slide, please. So in closing, I wanted to point out a couple of resources that have been really valuable to me in the last little while that you may want to explore. Of course, Richard's book on called Embers, and Richard Wagamese has so many books, but these Ojibwe meditations are beautiful. Of course, Braiding Sweetgrass, Knowing Home. A huge shout out to the folks that were involved in decolonizing the engineering curriculum. What an incredible resource, something to be very proud of. And then Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart was my winter reading last winter, and I just adored it. If you're looking for a map to understanding emotional intelligence, it is pretty incredible. And it talks about paradoxes. So just to close, some key things that I'm hoping that you'll take away from today. It's important to know who you are and what that means for how you show up in the world, to educate yourself and seek out resources, authorities, dissenting opinions, and alternate viewpoints on topics which you hold privilege, and making sure that you aren't requiring members of disadvantaged groups to be responsible for educating you. And that when you have a question, making sure that you ask it at an appropriate time. I encourage you to build a community of people around you to help you learn and unlearn the truth about the world, and learn from making mistakes. You aren't going to get it right every time. And so many people are so afraid to fail that they never actually start. Don't be afraid of failure. The important thing is to practice failing forward and being accountable. Own your mistakes, apologize, make amends, and move forward. Listen, recognize that you don't need to be heard all the time. And sometimes by insisting on your inclusion in conversations, you actually may risk reinforcing really harmful power dynamics. Listen first with critical listening and taking the time to understand what you're trying to navigate. Know what you want the legacy of your interactions to be and work to be, and what you ultimately want to leave behind. And finally, if your voice is one that has been made more important by privilege, use it for good. Lead with humility from where you are and be for each other. Don't speak for people and stand with them whenever you can. Chimegwich. For those in the room, there is no sound right now, just so you are aware.
Could you throw chat? I think it's working out. Can you hear me now, Colleen? Well, thank you for letting me know, and thank you also for that spectacular talk that covered so many important topics in such depth in such a short period of time. That is a lot for all of us to synthesize. I think it might take more than this one evening. But let's start with this evening. So please join me in a huge round of applause for Colleen. And we'll move into breakout circles, and the student facilitators, many of them, this is their first or second time facilitating. So we'll move you through tonight's facilitation plan to synthesize what you've heard with your own engineering practices. To the facilitators, I'll remind you to introduce yourselves, identify yourselves as the facilitators, and I hope to see you all at the third dialogue. Thank you very much. Good night.